The silence of Lethe was its most sacred text, a quietude cultivated over centuries and guarded more fiercely than any fortress. Here, in the heart of the oubliette sector, history was not celebrated, it was interred. Kalen was a keeper of this silence, a lament of the Second Order, and his life was a testament to the Concordance's foundational creed. Memory is the mother of all war. His days were spent in the cool, sterile corridors of the Echo Vaults, immense subterranean archives that held the galaxy's tormented past in crystalline stasis. He walked these halls, not as a scholar, but as a warden, tending to the caged nightmares of civilizations long since pacified. Each vault contained a memory too violent, too hateful, to be allowed loose in a galaxy that had purchased its fragile peace with a self-imposed amnesia. He would tune the resonance fields, recalibrate the psychic dampeners, and whisper reassurances to the data ghosts of atrocities, treating them with the detached reverence one affords a sleeping leviathan. He was young for a lament, his face still unlined by the gravity of his work, but his eyes held the ancient weariness of the histories he curated. He felt the echoes more than his mentors believed possible, a low thrum of sorrow that vibrated just beneath the silence, a constant companion in the endless twilight of the archives. This empathy was his secret shame, a flaw in the perfect detachment required of his order. To be a lament was to forget the self, to become a functionary of galactic forgetting. Yet Kalen remembered everything: the scent of ozone from the memory of the Signian Purge, the faint, phantom chill of the void maws of Krell, the dissonant psychic chord of a billion minds extinguished in the glassfire singularity. He was a physician to the galaxy's soul, and he feared it was making him sick. The first disruption was subtle, a flicker in the grand tapestry of silence. It began as a misplaced tool, a datacron left in a corridor Kalen was certain he had cleared. Then came the whispers, not from the vaults, but from the periphery of his own thoughts, like a name he couldn't quite recall. In the refectory, Elder Thrace paused mid-sentence, her expression clouding with a gentle confusion, before continuing on a completely different subject. Laments, whose minds were disciplined instruments of precision, began to exhibit small, unnerving lapses. A maintenance litany would be recited out of order. A vault's access code, committed to memory for decades, would vanish for a crucial second. These were dismissed as flickers of fatigue, the strain of their solemn work. But Kalen felt a pattern in the absences, a deliberate, curated void being carved into their reality. He noticed it most acutely during his rounds in the Epic Wing, where the memories of the last great conflict, the epic of silence, were stored. The resonance fields here were the strongest, the psychic hum a palpable pressure against his temples. One cycle, while monitoring the stasis crystal for the battle of wit's end, he saw it a single, hairline fracture in the data. A missing nanosecond of combat record. It was impossible. The crystals were self-repairing, their integrity absolute. Yet, the gap was there, a tiny patch of non-existence in a memory of total war. He felt a cold dread creep up his spine. Something was not just observing them, it was tasting them, taking tiny, experimental bites of their history, of their very selves. It was a hunger from outside the silence, a presence defined not by what it was, but by the perfect chilling emptiness it left behind. He reported the anomaly, but his concerns were logged with a placid nod by the senior laments. The systems were infallible, they assured him. The silence was absolute. The absolute broke on a Tuesday. It did not come with the clamor of alarms or the shriek of failing systems, but with a profound and terrifying cessation. One moment, Kalen was reinforcing the psychic wards on Vault 734, which held the memory of the Sun Eater campaign, a conflict so nihilistic its psychic residue could induce suicidal ideation. The next moment, the low thrum of the archive vanished. Not just the hum of machinery, but the deeper, ambient vibration of the caged memories. The silence he had cultivated his entire life was suddenly replaced by a true nothingness, a vacuum that pulled at his thoughts. Panic, an emotion rigorously trained out of every lament, seized him. He looked up at the vault's obsidian face and saw his reflection waver, his features blurring as if his own memory of himself was being questioned. Across the hall, a young acolyte screamed, a raw, piercing sound of pure terror, before clapping her hands over her mouth, her eyes wide with the shock of her own transgression. Then the memories began to leak, not as coherent visions, but as raw, weaponized emotion. From one vault spilled unrestrained fury, a wave of psychic heat that made Kalen's blood boil. From another, a torrent of crippling despair that buckled his knees and filled his throat with a sob for a loss that was not his own. The archive had become a psychic war zone, its ancient hatreds unleashed and undirected. Laments clawed at their temples, their faces contorted by the emotions as of soldiers dead for 1,000 years. The carefully constructed piece of Lethe had shattered, and its custodians were the first casualties. Kalen pushed himself to his feet, fighting back a surge of xenophobic paranoia, bleeding from a nearby vault. He had to get to the central nexus to initiate a full system purge, a desperate measure that would destroy the memories but might save the laments. But as he staggered down the corridor, dodging the psychic shrapnel of forgotten wars, he felt a pull, a gentle but insistent tug, not on his body, but on his very essence. It was a thread of calm in the maelstrom, a quiet invitation that emanated from a place he had never been, a section of the archive sealed by the first lament himself and forbidden to all. The pull led him to a simple, unadorned door of bare metal, cold to the touch. The corridor leading to it was pristine, untouched by the chaos raging through the rest of the archive. The psychic screams were muted here, held at bay by a force that felt ancient and serene. He didn't know the access code, had never seen the sigils carved above the lintel, but the door slid open at his approach as if it recognized him, as if it had been waiting. The room within was a perfect sphere, its walls a soft, pearlescent white. There were no stasis crystals, no monitoring terminals, no technology he could recognize. In the center of the chamber, floating a hand's breadth above a simple stone plinth, was a shimmering, silvery mass. It moved like mercury, coalescing into intricate patterns before dissolving again. A liquid intelligence held in a state of perpetual, silent contemplation. This was the mnemonic locus, the great secret of his order. A myth whispered about in the dormitories but never acknowledged by the elders. It was not a memory, but the vessel of memory itself, a symbiotic organism of pure data. As he stepped closer, the psychic chaos outside faded completely, shielded by the locus's passive aura. But a new pressure took its place, the focused, rapacious hunger of the entity that had breached their walls. The Cognivore. The name bloomed in his mind, unbidden. It was here, in this room, its intangible presence pressing in from all sides, and it was focused on him. It began to pick at the edges of his identity. He saw his induction ceremony into the laments, the proud face of his mentor, Elder Thrace, and then watched as her features melted like wax, the memory turning to smoke. He tried to recall his childhood home on Cygnus X1, but found only a gray, featureless landscape. The Cognivore was unraveling him, thread by thread, consuming the tapestry of his life to fuel its own existence. He was a lament, his mind was a fortress, but this was a siege he could not withstand. His name, Kalen, began to feel foreign on his own tongue. In a final, desperate act of self-preservation, a primal scream against the encroaching void of unbeing, he reached out and plunged his hand into the liquid, shimmering heart of the mnemonic locus. The contact was not an explosion, but an implosion. His consciousness, already frayed and dissolving, was pulled into the locus with breathtaking speed. He did not see battlefields or hear the screams of the dying. Instead, he felt a profound and crushing sense of peace, a sorrow so deep and vast it was indistinguishable from love. He was drowning in the unfiltered history of the galaxy, not as a series of events, but as a single, unified experience. He felt the birth of stars and the heat death of universes. He comprehended the brutal calculus of 1,000 forgotten wars, the strategic brilliance of long-dead admirals, the desperate courage of doomed soldiers. But dominating it all was a single, powerful consciousness, the locus's last host. It was a mind of impossible complexity and yet perfect stillness. A historian who had not just studied war, but had absorbed it, understood its rhythms and its paradoxes so completely that he had learned the secret to its ending. The liquid silver surged up Kalen's arm, flowing over his skin not like armor, but like an extension of his own nervous system. A second skin woven from pure memory. It stabilized his fracturing identity, anchoring him with the weight of its own immense past. The Cognivore's assault, which had been seconds from erasing him completely, slammed against this new reality and recoiled. In the quiet of his mind, Kalen was no longer alone. The locus was with him, around him, inside him. He could feel the disembodied hunger of the Cognivore refocusing, its immense psychic appetite now fixed on the glorious, irresistible feast he had become the brightest, most concentrated beacon of memory in a galaxy sworn to forget. And then a voice, calm and resonant and impossibly old, spoke not in his ears but in the very center of his soul. It was the echo of the locus's last host, a ghost in the machine of memory itself. "It has found us," the voice said, not in fear, but with the weary resignation of a watchman whose long vigil had finally come to an end. The world Kalen returned to was a symphony of agony. As his consciousness flooded back into his body, the mnemonic locus settled around him, a cool, silver integument that flowed from his hand up his arm and across his torso, tracing the lines of his nervous system like a cartographer mapping a new world. It felt less like an object and more like a second, more perfect, memory of himself overlaid upon the first. The psychic chaos of the archive was no longer a disorienting storm, but a landscape he could suddenly read. He saw the raw emotion of fury and understood its source, the final, betrayed charge of the Verkosian Guard at the siege of the Binary Crown. He felt the wave of despair and recognized the collective grief of a species watching its homeworld star go nova. The memories were not just data, they were experiences, and the locus was the ultimate empathy engine, allowing him to inhabit them without being consumed. The Cognivore was there, too. It was not a creature of flesh or energy or the, but a flaw in reality, a patch of anti-meaning. Where it passed, coherence frayed. He could perceive it now as a spreading stain of non-information, a moving void that was actively unwriting the universe. It was currently pressing against the spherical chamber, its immense hunger baffled by the sheer density of 1 billion years of history concentrated into a single point. "It does not understand what you have become." The Sentinel's voice echoed in his mind, a calm and steadying presence. To it, You are an anomaly, a black hole of information in its vacuum. It will try to comprehend you before it consumes you. That is our only advantage." Kalen staggered to his feet, his limbs feeling both heavy with his own mortality and impossibly light with the locust's knowledge. The silver on his skin shimmered, solidifying into a thin, flexible armor where the cognivore's pressure was most intense. "What do I do?" Kalen thought, the question directed at the ancient consciousness now intertwined with his own. "Forgetting was our shield. It has been broken. Now, memory must be our sword, which we must leave this place. The archive is a tomb, and it is drawing the hunger to it. I must disperse the memory, make it too vast and too diffuse for the cognivore to devour in one place." Kalen looked at the door. Outside was a madhouse of screaming minds and psychic fallout. "My friends, the other laments. They are trapped in the echoes you once guarded," the sentinel replied, his tone tinged with a sorrow that felt millennia deep. "Their minds, so long dedicated to silence, cannot process this much sound. You can help them, but each time you access the locus, you will shine brighter, and the hunger will grow more focused. The choice is yours." Lament Kalen. He didn't hesitate. To leave them was to dishonor the very reason he'd joined the order to protect. He pushed the door open and stepped back into the chaos. The corridor was a war zone of the soul. Laments lay convulsing on the floor or stood frozen, their eyes vacant as they relived historical atrocities. He saw Elder Thrace, his mentor, huddled against a wall, her face a mask of terror. Halen approached her cautiously. He could feel the memory that had ensnared her. She was on the bridge of a Concordance cruiser, the Silent Vigil. During the Battle of Wit's End, alarms she couldn't hear were blaring in her mind. The ship's hull was screaming as it tore apart, and she was watching her crew die. It was a loop, a psychic scar tissue playing over and over. "I cannot break her out by force." Kalen projected toward the sentinel. "You are not a warrior. Kalen, you are a librarian." The sentinel's voice guided him. "Find the book she is trapped in. Find the part of the story that does not belong." Kalen closed his eyes, letting the locust extend his consciousness. He sank into the memory with her, a ghost on the bridge of the dying ship. He felt the explosions, smelled the burning circuits, tasted the metallic tang of fear. He saw Thrace as a young officer, trying to seal a plasma conduit. But as he sifted through the memory, he found the anomaly, the hairline fracture he had noticed before. In the original record, the officer, a woman named Lyra, had succeeded in sealing the conduit, sacrificing herself to save 3 others before the bridge collapsed. But in the memory gripping Thrace, Lyra failed. The conduit exploded, and the loop of her death repeated endlessly. The cognivore hadn't just been tasting memories, it had been poisoning them, rewriting them with despair, turning them from records of sacrifice into testaments of failure. Kalen reached into the narrative, his locus-enhanced consciousness a scalpel of pure intent. He found the corrupted data stream and reinforced the original memory, the truth of Lyra's courage. He didn't erase the pain, but he restored its meaning. On the floor of the corridor, Elder Thrace gasped, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on her cheek. The terror in her eyes was replaced by a profound, weary sadness. She looked at Kalen, at the shimmering silver that now covered half his body, and her gaze held not fear, but a dawning, horrified understanding. "What have you done?" she whispered, her voice hoarse. "I remembered," Kalen said, and helped her to her feet. The act had cost him. The psychic pressure from the cognivore doubled, a focused spike of attention that made the locus on his skin ripple and glow. They gathered who they could, a small, shell-shocked band of laments led by a walking, breathing heresy. Kalen moved from one to the next, not healing them, but re-anchoring their minds in the true context of the memories that assaulted them. He became a psychic anchor, the locus a lighthouse in the storm. With each intervention, he felt the cognivore's scrutiny intensify, its nature shifting from confusion to a cold, analytical hunger. It was learning him. Their destination was the surface, the archive's grand entrance hall and the shuttle bay beyond. But their path was blocked. A cadre of senior laments, led by the stoic High Warden Torvin, stood in the central nexus, their minds shielded, their faces grim. They had weathered the initial psychic storm through sheer discipline, and what they saw was not a savior, but a contagion. Torvin's eyes were fixed on the locus, which now pulsed with a soft inner light, reacting to Kalen's emotional state. "Abomination," Torvin declared, his voice amplified by the hall's acoustics. "You have broken your vows. You have communed with the unremembered. You are a vessel of the very chaos we are sworn to contain." "The chaos is already here," Kalen countered, his voice steady. He could feel the fear beneath Torvin's rigid control, a deep, dogmatic terror of contamination. "Apathy was our shield, and it has failed. Now only knowledge will suffice." "The Concordance decreed that knowledge is the disease," Torvin retorted, raising a hand. Behind him, the other laments adopted meditative stances, their combined mental fortitude creating a tangible wall of force, a psychic barrier designed to pacify and contain. "We will quarantine you, Kalen. We will seal you back in the heart of the archive with the monster you have embraced." The psychic wall pressed in, not an attack, but an immense, crushing weight of pure negation. It was the distilled essence of their creed, an attempt to force silence and stillness upon him. Kalen's knees buckled. The locust flared, trying to counter it, but it was like using a searchlight to stop a tsunami. "Do not fight their silence with more noise," the sentinel advised. "Show them the silence they have forgotten. Show them its cost." Kalen stopped resisting. He let the psychic pressure wash over him, and, with the locus as his lens, he reached for a single, specific memory stored in the deepest, most secure vault in the archive. The memory of the Concordance's founding. He didn't project it as a weapon, but as an offering. He let the senior laments see it through his eyes. They saw the end of the epic of silence, a war so vast it had been fought with planet killers and temporal weapons. They saw entire species erased from the timeline, galaxies choked with the ghosts of what might have been. They witnessed the architects of the final piece, their faces etched with horror at the price of victory, making their terrible choice. They chose to amputate history, to cut away the infected limb of memory to save the body of the galaxy. But Kalen, guided by the Sentinel, showed them the part of the memory that had been sealed even from the laments themselves, the first lament's final testament. They saw him standing before the nascent mnemonic locus, explaining that the silence was not an answer, but a pause, a time for the galaxy to heal, to grow, until a generation arose that was strong enough to bear the burden of its own past, to learn from it without repeating it. "We do not bury the past because we hate it." The first lament's voice echoed in their minds, a shared revelation. "We preserve it because we love the future." The psychic wall dissolved. Torvin stumbled back, his face pale, The certainty in his eyes shattered and replaced by a terrible 100-century-old doubt. "It was a cocoon," he whispered in disbelief. "Not a cage." There was no more time for debate. The entire structure of the archive groaned, a deep, resonant shudder that spoke of failing integrity fields. The cognivore was no longer pressing. It was beginning to feed. Sections of the archive were ceasing to exist, not collapsing into rubble, but simply vanishing from reality, leaving behind smooth, featureless walls of absolute nothing. "We have to go. Now," Kalen urged. The laments, their dogma broken, followed without question. They moved through the disintegrating corridors, running from an enemy that erased the very ground behind them. As they reached the grand entrance hall, Kalen saw the true extent of the damage. The sky of Lethe, visible through the high arched windows, was wrong. The stars were missing, the familiar constellations replaced by a uniform, inky blackness. Cognivore was erasing the sky. Below, in the monastery's courtyard, he saw laments and acolytes wandering in confusion, their conversations halting, their faces slack with a strange placidity. They would forget a word mid-sentence and simply stop talking, unable to recall what they were saying or why. The amnesia was spreading beyond the archive, a psychic pandemic of forgetting. The shuttle bay was their only hope. It was a chaotic scene, with terrified pilots and monastery staff trying to launch evacuation vessels, their procedures hampered by the creeping cognitive decay. A pilot would stare blankly at a pre-flight checklist, the symbols suddenly meaningless. A navigator would plot a course to a star system that no longer existed in her memory. This was the cognivore's true power, not a violent erasure, but a gentle, inexorable fading into ignorance. Kalen strode onto the main launch pad, the silver locus a beacon of terrible purpose in the spreading twilight. He needed a ship, a fast one, with a navigator who could still remember the stars. He found her huddled in the cockpit of a long-range courier, a woman named Ilara, her knuckles white as she gripped the controls, muttering star charts to herself like a prayer to hold off the encroaching emptiness. She looked up as he entered, her eyes widening at the sight of him. What are you?" she stammered. "I'm the memory this galaxy chose to forget," Kalen said, the locus pulsing in time with his heartbeat. He looked back at Torvin and the other laments. "Go, warn the concordance. Tell them the silence is broken. Tell them to remember." Torvin simply nodded, his expression one of profound loss and newfound duty. Kalen turned back to the pilot. "Take us to the core. Anywhere but here." As the courier ship lifted off the pad, banking hard over the dissolving monastery, Kalen looked down at the world he was leaving behind. Lethe, the heart of the Great Forgetting, was becoming a perfect blank slate. The cognivore's hunger was unsated. It had tasted the archive, but now it had tasted him, a movable feast of infinite richness. He felt its attention detach from the dying world and fix onto their small ship as it punched through the atmosphere into a starless void. He was no longer a keeper in a silent library. He was the library itself, and his overdue notice had just been served. The courier ship, the stray dog, was a vessel built for silence, designed to slip through customs patrols and sensor nets on whisper-quiet drives. But this was a silence of a different order. It was a dead, suffocating quiet that pressed in on the cockpit, a silence that had devoured the stars themselves. Ilara gripped the flight yoke, her navigator's instinct screaming that she was flying blind into nothing. Yet her instruments insisted they were moving at a phenomenal velocity. The view screen was a perfect, featureless black, not the gentle, star-dusted black of deep space, but the absolute void of a redacted document. "Talk to me," she said, her voice tight, never taking her eyes off the impossible view. "Talk to me right now, or I swear I will turn the ship around and fly it right back into whatever the hell that was." Kalen sat in the co-pilot's chair, the mnemonic locus a liquid silver filigree that now covered his entire left arm and spread across his chest like a shattered mirror. It pulsed with a soft, internal luminescence, a lonely star in their private night. He was still processing the torrent of information from the locus, the Sentinel's consciousness, a constant, guiding presence within his own. "Turning around wouldn't matter," Kalen said, his voice distant. "There's nothing to go back to. Lethe is gone. Not destroyed, erased." Alara finally looked at him, her face a mask of hardened disbelief. "Erased planets don't get erased. Stars don't get erased. That's not how physics works. The cognivore doesn't obey physics," Kalen replied, the name of the entity feeling heavy and foul in his mouth. "It consumes it. It feeds on information, on patterns, on reality itself. It finds the universe, and it unwrites it." He raised his silvered hand, watching the light swirl within it. "The Laments believed memory was a disease. We built a sanctuary of silence to protect the galaxy from its own past. But we were wrong. The silence wasn't a shield. It was a dinner bell." The Sentinel's voice flowed through him, cool and clear. "She requires a context she can grasp. Kalen, give her one." Kalen focused, letting the locus sift through its near-infinite library. He found a memory, not of a battle, but of a lecture. A physicist from a long-dead civilization explaining the theoretical underpinning of their reality. "Imagine the universe is a story," Kalen began, his voice taking on the rhythmic cadence of the ancient professor. "Every particle, every star, every law of nature is a word, a sentence, a paragraph in that story. What is chasing us? It's the ultimate editor. It doesn't burn the book. It just crosses out the words, leaving behind a perfect, meaningless blank page." Alara stared at him, her pragmatic mind struggling to find purchase on the metaphor. "And you, what is that? Stuff on you. This is the mnemonic locus," he explained. "It's the book the cognivore wants to read before it erases it. It is the collected, unabridged history of everything, and right now, it's the densest, most complex, most written thing in this sector of the galaxy. It is a feast. That is why the stars are gone. The cognivore is no longer grazing on the background radiation of reality. It has focused its hunger entirely on us." The ship shuddered, a low, groaning vibration that had no physical cause. The lights in the cockpit flickered, and for a half-second, the chemical formula for the recycled air, stenciled on a bulkhead, became a string of meaningless symbols before snapping back into place. The cognivore was tasting the ship, probing its reality. Alara's hands flew across the console, her face grim. Its wake is catching up. It's not a gravitational field. It's a decay field. It's corroding reality. At this rate, the stray dog will cease to be a coherent concept in 3 hours. "Can you go faster?" Kalen asked. "I'm already pushing the engines past every safety protocol ever written," she shot back. "Where are we even going? There's no there to go to anymore." "That is not entirely true," the Sentinel's voice interjected in Kalen's mind. "There are places where memory is strong, where the story of the universe is written so deeply that even the cognivore would have to pause to erase it. Places of great informational density. Echoes." Kalen relayed the information. "We need to find an echo, a place with history, A graveyard of ships, a collapsed star, a nexus of old trade routes. Anywhere the universe is loud. Alara's face hardened with a sudden, desperate resolve. For a navigator, the idea of a starless void was a personal hell. The idea of a place with echoes, with landmarks, was a lifeline. Her fingers danced across the navigation controls, bypassing the dead visual sensors and diving deep into the ship's archival stellar maps. Most of the old hyperlanes are cold, but there's one possibility. A place my grandfather warned me never to fly through, said it was haunted by the ghosts of 1,000 dead ships. The cartographer's veil. The veil was not a place one arrived at so much as fell into. One moment, they were in the perfect black. The next, they were adrift in a sea of spectral light. It was a vast nebula, a stellar nursery that had died billions of years ago, and its dust and gas were now the tomb of countless ships from countless eras. Hulks of ancient dreadnoughts, sleek outlines of forgotten exploration vessels, and the shattered husks of pirate craft floated in a silent, cosmic ballet. Each wreck trailed a faint, shimmering wake of data flickering distress calls, fragments of engine signatures, the last echoes of their existence. The sheer density of information was a balm to Kalen's senses after the sterile void, pushed back against the cognivore's encroaching nothingness. The locus on his skin seemed to drink in the ambient data, to silver light steadying, but the relief was short-lived. The cognivore had followed them, manifested not as a ship or a monster, but as a creeping stillness at the edge of the nebula. A vast, circular patch of the veil began to darken, the ethereal colors of the gas clouds draining away, the ghost ships within that sphere winking out of existence one by one. The silence was coming for the echoes. "It's here," Alara whispered, her voice tight with dread. "It's erasing the graveyard." The ship's proximity alarms began to chime, a frantic, discordant melody. "It's not just erasing them," she said, her eyes wide. "It's using the erasure to pinpoint our location. Every ship that vanishes is a sonar ping that tells it where we are. Then we must be louder than they are." The sentinel's voice resonated within Kalen. "You are the archive." "Kalen, it is time you opened a book." The cognivore's attention slammed into the stray dog. It wasn't a physical blow, but a psychic one. Alara cried out, clutching her head. "The nav charts, they're blank. I can't remember the vectors, the escape routes. I don't know how to fly." It was attacking her defining trait, her identity as a navigator. Kalen felt a different assault. The cognivore wasn't trying to erase his memories, but to force them all upon him at once. He saw his own past, twisted and weaponized. The memory of his induction into the laments became a ceremony of damnation. The face of his long-dead mother appeared, her expression not of love, but of cold, alien accusation. It was trying to break his sense of self, to make him a chaotic, useless vessel for the locust to inhabit. He fought back, clinging to the sentinel's calm. "Show me how," he pleaded, his own mind fragmenting under the assault. "You cannot out-silence it," the sentinel replied. "So you must tell a better story, a brighter one, a story of creation. Find the memory of a star being born." Kalen plunged his consciousness into the infinite library of the locus. He bypassed wars and apocalypses, tragedies and triumphs, searching for a single primordial event. He found it in the memory of a species that had existed when the universe was young, a species of pure energy that had witnessed Genesis. He grabbed hold of the memory, a concept so vast it threatened to annihilate his sanity. And he pulled it out of the locus and, through his own will, he projected it. Outside the ship, A new light dawned in the cartographer's veil. It began as a pinpoint of impossible brightness and then erupted outwards, a silent, blossoming flower of pure energy and nascent matter. Kaylin was projecting the memory of a supernova, a stellar birth, directly into the face of the void. It was an overwhelming flood of information, of physics, of creation. The cognivore, the entity of anti-meaning, recoiled from the sheer, explosive meaning of a star's birth. The psychic assault on the ship ceased. The black, creeping void at the edge of the nebula halted its advance, its perfect nothingness momentarily disrupted by the story of everything. Alara gasped, the navigation charts flooding back into her mind. She didn't waste the opportunity. Her hands flew over the controls, and the stray dog lurched forward, diving deep into the densest part of the wreck field, using the ghosts of dead ships as cover. The light of Kaylin's projected star faded, the effort leaving him slumped in his chair, trembling and pale. The silver of the locust was dull, its light dimmed. Blood trickled from his nose. "Did it work?" he managed to ask, his voice a raw whisper. Alara, her eyes blazing with a newfound, terrifying clarity, looked from the fading light behind them to the field of wrecks ahead. "It bought us time," she said, "but you just painted a target on the entire galaxy. You showed it exactly what you're capable of." Kaylin looked down at his arm, at the quieted locust. He had fought back. He had become the weapon his order had never imagined. "It isn't just hungry anymore," the Sentinel's voice said, a grim finality in its tone. "Now, it is afraid. It will not stop until the story of this universe, and you with it, has been utterly and completely unwritten. It knows we are not just running, we are searching, and it will do anything to prevent us from reaching the Genesis Anvil." The name hung in Kaylin's mind, a concept as new and as terrifying as the star he had just created. It was not just a destination, it was an answer, and it was their only hope, the Genesis Anvil. The name resonated in Kaylin's mind not as a place, but as a purpose. The Sentinel fed him fragments of understanding, glimpses of a concept so profound it bordered on cosmological heresy. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense, nor a fortress. It was, the Sentinel explained, the universe's original printing press. It was the hypothetical locus point, the metaphysical foundry where the foundational laws of their reality were first laid down, where the story of existence was first written. To reach it was to reach the source code of everything. If the cognivore is an editor, the anvil is the author. The Sentinel's voice explained as the stray dog navigated the treacherous currents of the veil. "It is the only place where a new story can be told, a story the cognivore cannot erase." Alara, weaving the ship through the skeletal remains of a kilometer-long warship, overheard him muttering. She shot him a sharp look. "Talking to your arm again if you're going to have a psychotic break. Do it quietly. I need to concentrate." The cognivore was adapting. It was no longer trying to erase the veil in a broad, sweeping front. Instead, it employed a terrifying new tactic. It was killing the ghosts. A single, ancient frigate, trailing a faint blue echo of its last moments, would suddenly go dark. Its data wake would vanish, its spectral form dissolving into nothing. The cognivore was hunting them, plucking the echoes out of existence one by one, methodically starving them of the very history they were using as cover. Each time a wreck vanished, a shockwave of non-existence would ripple through the nebula, causing the stray dog's sensors to flicker and its inertial dampeners to groan. It was a slow, deliberate strangulation. "It's corralling us," Alara said, her knuckles white on the controls. It's destroying the outer Rex, forcing us deeper into the Veil's core. It's setting a trap. The core is where we need to go, Kalen said. His focus turned inward. He was searching the locus, not for weapons, but for a map. The Genesis anvil wasn't on any star chart. It didn't exist in physical space. It's a location in space-time. The Sentinel guided him. A moment, not a place. The universe has expanded around it, but the echo of its creation remains, accessible only to those who know the frequency of its song. Kalen felt a surge of despair. I don't know the song. No, the Sentinel replied, but you are library of 1,000,000,000,000 songs. We must find the one who did. The search was an agony. Kalen plunged into the memories of forgotten races, of scholars and mystics, of madmen who had glimpsed the architecture of the cosmos. He experienced lifetimes of fruitless searching, felt the sting of intellectual dead ends, and the soul-crushing weight of cosmic insignificance. He lived through the minds of 1,000 seekers who had all failed. The locus, which had been a tool, now felt like a cage, trapping him in an endless cycle of inherited failure. The strain was immense. The silver on his skin began to crawl, its patterns shifting erratically. He could feel his own identity thinning, fraying at the edges as he was overwhelmed by the ghosts of the locus's past. Alara glanced at him, her expression a mixture of fear and a strange, grudging concern. Hey, librarian, stay with me. Your face is phasing. He didn't respond. He was lost in the memory of a creature from a gaseous nebula, a being of pure thought that had perceived the universe as a symphony of quantum vibrations. It had spent its entire existence trying to isolate the first note, the chord of creation. It had come closer than anyone, but its life had ended before it could succeed. Its final thought, a lingering, unresolved musical phrase. That was it. The key. It wasn't a map. It was a half-finished piece of music. I have it. Kalen gasped, his consciousness snapping back to the cockpit with a jolt. It's a resonance key, a frequency. You have to tune the ship's drive core to it. Alara stared at him as if he'd grown a second head. Tune the drive core to a song? That's not how a singularity engine works. I'd tear a hole in reality. That's exactly what we need to do, Kalen insisted, a feverish light in his eyes. We're not flying to the anvil. We're punching a hole through the story of the universe to get back to the first page. He began to hum, a strange, atonal melody that seemed to bend the air in the cockpit. The locus on his skin resonated with the sound, glowing with a soft, harmonic light. Reluctantly, her own pragmatic mind screaming in protest, Alara began to translate the alien melody into mathematical terms, her fingers flying across her console. It was the most insane piece of navigation she had ever attempted, routing primary power through the navigational deflectors and attempting to modulate the output of a miniature black hole according to the musical theory of a dead gas cloud. As she worked, the Cognivore's trap sprang. From the core of the nebula, a dozen points of absolute blackness appeared, swallowing the wrecks around them. They were focused voids, miniature avatars of the Cognivore itself, and they were converging on the stray dog's position. Whatever you're doing, do it now, she yelled over the rising shriek of the abused drive core. We've got company. Kalen closed his eyes, focusing his entire being on the resonant frequency. He poured the memory, the hope, and the near madness of the gaseous seeker into the ship's systems. The locus flared, acting as a psychic amplifier, a tuning fork for reality itself. The stray dog began to vibrate violently, the metal of its hull groaning as it was subjected to impossible, contradictory physical laws. On the view screen, the world outside dissolved. The wrecks, the nebula, the encroaching voids, they all smeared into streaks of light and color, the very fabric of space-time stretching thin. The ship wasn't moving through space anymore. It was tunneling beneath it. And then, with a sound that was half chime, half scream, they broke through. They were floating in a sea of pure potential. There were no stars, no planets, only an infinite, pearlescent twilight filled with the faint, shimmering outlines of possibilities. They could see the nascent forms of physical laws, the ghostly architecture of mathematics, the embryonic shapes of future galaxies. It was the universe before it had settled on what it wanted to be. And in the center of it all, impossibly vast, was the Genesis Anvil. It was a structure of light and gravity, a swirling vortex of creation where ideas were being hammered into existence, a silent, continuous explosion of being. The stray dog, a tiny, insignificant mote of solidified reality, drifted towards it. The ship was already beginning to unravel, its physical form too rigid for this fluid, pre-physical state. Bulkheads flickered, becoming transparent for a moment before snapping back. "The ship won't last long here," the sentinel's voice stated, a sense of profound urgency in its tone. "This place is poison to anything that is already written. You must go to the anvil, Kaylin, and you must go now." Kaylin looked at Alara. Her face was pale, a thin line of blood trickling from one nostril. Her eyes were wide with a navigator's awe at seeing the ultimate map. "Go," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Name a star after me if you get the chance." He nodded, a silent promise passing between them. He sealed the cockpit and cycled the airlock. As the outer door opened, he did not step into a vacuum, but into pure concept. There was no need for a suit. There was no environment to protect him from. He was a story walking into the library of creation. As he drifted towards the anvil, he saw that they were not alone. The cognivore was here. It manifested differently in this place of pure potential. It was a creeping, cancerous gray that leached the color and possibility out of the twilight. It was a tide of entropy, a force of anti-creation, and it was moving towards the anvil from the other side, drawn by the same desperate imperative that had brought Kaylin here. It knew. It understood that whoever controlled the anvil could not just edit the story, but could end it altogether, unwriting it back to the first word and then silencing even that. He felt the Sentinel's consciousness surge within him, a lifetime of guardianship culminating in this one, final moment. "It has come to erase the author," the Sentinel said. "You must become the author, Kaylin. You must write a new law." Kaylin floated before the swirling vortex of the anvil, the sheer creative force of it threatening to overwhelm him. The locus on his body shone with the light of 1,000,000,000 dying stars, a library preparing to make its final stand. He could feel the cognivore's presence now, a vast and ancient intellect, a being not of malice, but of horrifying, absolute purpose. It had existed before the universe, in the perfect silence that preceded creation, and it viewed all of existence as a noisy messy corruption of that pristine state. It didn't want to conquer the universe. It wanted to correct it, to put it back where it belonged. He could feel it probing him, offering him a bargain. It showed him a vision of a galaxy at peace, a perfect, unchanging stillness where no one could ever suffer or die because no one had ever lived. It was the ultimate expression of the Lament's creed, the silence he had once been sworn to uphold. It was a tempting, seductive poison. For a moment, the weary librarian in him, The boy who had spent his life tending to the galaxy's pain was tempted to accept. He had only to let go of the locus to let the story end. The story is not yours to end. The Sentinel's voice cut through the temptation, sharp and clear. It belongs to all who live it. You are not its judge, and you are its protector. The doubt vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. Kalen turned his full attention to the anvil. He couldn't destroy the cognivore. It was a fundamental force, as essential to reality as creation itself. But he could write a law, a rule, a paradox that even a being of anti-meaning would be forced to obey. He reached out with his mind, the locus serving as his pen, and he began to write on the canvas of reality itself. He did not write of weapons or shields. He wrote of a story about a lonely, hungry void that consumed all other stories, and in doing so, became the only story left. And by becoming the only story, it gave itself the very meaning it sought to destroy, trapping itself in a perfect, unbreakable loop of self-defeating purpose. It was a cage made of logic, a prison of cosmic irony. The cognivore felt the new law beginning to settle, to crystallize into truth, and it lunged, not at Kalen, but at the anvil itself. A desperate attempt to silence creation before the final word could be written. The cognivore's lunge was not a physical act, but a conceptual one. It was a wave of absolute negation, an assertion of non-existence so powerful that the pearlescent twilight of the Genesis space curdled and went gray. The shimmering possibilities, the nascent forms of future galaxies, withered and died in its path. It was a direct assault on the very idea of to be. Kalen felt it as a profound, a personal erasure. The locus on his skin screamed, not with sound, but with the sudden, violent loss of information. Entire epochs of history, the memories of suns and civilizations, were being unwritten from its archives as the cognivore's anti-meaning washed over them. It was like watching a library burn, but infinitely worse. The books weren't just turning to ash, they were ceasing to have ever existed at all. His own name, Kalen, felt thin, the letters losing their shape in his mind. The Sentinel's presence, his anchor in the storm, wavered like a dying flame. It is unmaking our history to unmake us. The ancient consciousness transmitted, its voice strained, laced with the static of dissolving data. The law is not yet set. The ink is not yet dry. You must finish it. Kalen, you must become the final word. Kalen fought back the tide of his own dissolution, focusing on the anvil before him. The swirling vortex of creation was recoiling from the cognivore's touch, its light dimming, its creative energy faltering. He had to anchor the new law, to hammer it into the very firmament of reality. He reached out with his locust-clad hand, not to touch the anvil, was to become one with it. He poured himself into the vortex. The sensation was one of complete and utter deconstruction. His physical form dissolved instantly, his consciousness shattering into a billion points of light, each one a memory, a feeling, a single moment of his life. He was no longer Kalen, the lament. He was the grief of a forgotten war. He was the joy of a first discovery. He was the scent of ozone on Cygnus X1. He was the terror of the archive's collapse and the grim determination in Alara's eyes. He was every story the locus held, and he offered them all to the anvil, not as data, but as sacrifice. He was the ink. The anvil accepted his sacrifice. The vortex of creation flared, no longer pearlescent, but a brilliant, defiant silver, infused with the totality of the mnemonic locus. Kalen's shattered consciousness became the loom upon which a new reality could be woven. He felt the paradox. He had conceived the story of the self-consuming story being forged, hammered into a fundamental constant of the new physics. The law of narrative conservation. A story cannot be erased, only retold. Meaning can never be destroyed, only transformed. It was a subtle, elegant piece of cosmic legislation, a metaphysical judo throw. The cognivore, in its act of consumption, would now be forced to preserve the very thing it was consuming in a new form. It could eat the story of a star, but in doing so, it would become the story of a star being eaten. It could no longer create a blank page. It could only create a new, albeit tragic, chapter. The wave of negation slammed into the newly shining anvil and broke against the new law. The cognivore, for the first time in its ageless existence, faltered. It could not erase the anvil, for the anvil now contained the story of the cognivore itself. To unmake it would be to unmake itself. It was trapped. It let out a silent, psychic scream of pure, undiluted frustration, a shriek that echoed not through space, but through the very logic of the cosmos. The gray tide of entropy receded, pulling back from the anvil. It did not flee. It simply stopped. It was still there, a permanent and fundamental shadow. But it was now contained by the very nature of the reality it sought to end. It had been transformed from an editor into a character, its role in the universal narrative forever changed from antagonist to a grim, necessary force of cosmic balance. Kalen's consciousness, scattered and spent, began to coalesce. He was no longer a man. The locus was gone, its contents woven into the fabric of the new universe. The Sentinel's ancient voice was silent, its long watch finally over. He was something new, a disembodied point of view, a ghost woven from the memory of a boy who had once guarded silence. He saw the Genesis space begin to stabilize, the new law settling like fine dust, and he saw the stray dog, battered and flickering, still holding together through Alara's sheer, stubborn will. He felt a pang of something he remembered as affection, as gratitude. He had one final act to perform, one last sentence to write. He reached out with his intangible will and nudged the ship, guiding it back towards the tear in reality it had created. He couldn't go with it. He was part of this place now, a permanent fixture of the universe's opening chapter. He was the preface. The ship slipped back through the tear, and the portal to the nascent universe sealed behind it, leaving him in the quiet, eternal twilight of the beginning. Alara found herself back in the cartographer's veil, but it was different. The stars were back, not just the faint, local suns of the nebula, but the full, breathtaking sweep of the galactic arm, a river of diamonds on black velvet. The silence was gone, replaced by the gentle, ambient hum of a living cosmos. The wrecks around her still floated, but they were no longer trailing faint, dying data ghosts. Instead, each ship, each fragment of hull, glowed with a soft silver light. She ran a diagnostic and stared at the results in disbelief. They were emitting a low-level, complex signal, a story, the final log of a captain, the love letter of a doomed engineer, the defiant war cry of a Marine. Their histories had not been erased. They had been enshrined. The veil was no longer a graveyard. It had become a library. She looked at the empty co-pilot's seat, a lump forming in her throat. She touched the console, and a new star chart bloomed on the screen, a map of the galaxy as it now was. Near the center, a newly charted, unnamed blue star shone with a steady, peaceful light. She smiled, a sad, weary, but genuine smile. One star, she whispered to the silence. Kaylin's star. It's a good story. She plotted a course for the Concordance capital. Her ship no longer a stray dog, but a messenger carrying the most important news in galactic history. The silence was broken. The universe remembered. Across the galaxy, things began to change. On 1,000 world, people would find a datachron they had lost. A memory of a loved one would return with sudden, startling clarity. Historians would discover that texts thought lost were inexplicably restored. The great forgetting was over. Memory, in all its painful, glorious, and dangerous beauty, had been returned to the universe. And in the heart of creation, a librarian stood as silent, eternal watch, no longer guarding a tomb of endings, but tending a garden of infinite beginnings.